Well, it is 6 o'clock, so we will get us started as people keep hopping on in here. But I'll do a quick little introduction. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited for you to join the discussion. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the book Iowa Changing Wildlife: 3 Decades of Gain and Loss. And my name is Brianna. I am the Conservation Program Coordinator here at Sierra Club Iowa chapter, and I'll just be here moderating. But before we begin, I do want to let you know that this is being recorded, so those that couldn't join us today will be able to watch it and kind of go through some questions and come up with their own thoughts along the way. And then currently your mics are muted, but if you have any comments or want to kind of hop in the discussion, raise your hand, put it in the comment box, let us know, and we'll get you off mute so we can kind of get that discussion going a little bit more. But tonight, the conversation is all about exploring how Iowa's landscape and wildlife have changed over the past 30 years. You know, what species have been thriving, which ones are struggling, and what all of these changes mean for conservation and for all of us that care deeply about protecting our natural world. And we are so excited to have Tom Reardon, the Vice Chair of Sierra Club Iowa Chapter's Executive Committee, be hosting us today and kind of hold the discussion and have some questions for us. Um, but again, this is an open space, very welcoming. And whether you've read the book cover to cover or just curious about some of the topics, your questions and perspectives are very valued. So feel free to add your thoughts again in the chat, raise your hand, and we'd love to hear from you. And so with that, we'll get started and dive into this conversation on Iowa's changing wildlife. Tom, I'll let you take it off.
Okay. Like Brianna said, the book we're discussing today is James and Stephen Dinsmore's Iowa Changing Wildlife: 3 Decades of Gain and Loss, which is basically a follow-up to James Dinsmore's 1994 book, A Country So Full of Game, where he tracked the changes in wildlife in Iowa from pre-settlement times to about the early 1900s, 1910s, 20s or so, when most of the major impact had occurred and before a lot of the conservation laws took effect. So a lot of the wildlife populations were pretty much decimated by that time. And he gave some brief introductions to some of the more modern changes that had come in up until uh, the 1980s, maybe. Changing Wildlife takes up where game leaves off and it enumerates a number of the changes that occurred since 1994 and lists a number of successes and failures in rebuilding populations that have become decimated and the reintroduction of animals that were pretty much extirpated from Iowa. Both of these books leave out a lot of wildlife since they concentrate on birds and mammals of economic importance, game animals, fur bearers, top predators. But this book covers a larger number of species than the original book. I think it covers 60 species and adds some important non-game species such as bats to the mix. And it's also looking at a time period, 1990s on, where, again, a large number of changes in land use were happening in Iowa. So, as I guess Wally Taylor once mentioned, a country so full of game, Iowa's changing wildlife can be looked at mostly a reference text, and so can this book. And I personally find, I think, the last 3 chapters to be the most thought-provoking. Uh, I'm looking at my job as moderator now, and I'm hopefully a lot of people have read the book, because my job as moderator is now becoming shut up and let the discussion flow. So I'll start off with one question, and at the end, maybe come back with another. So the question would be, I guess, the big one, what do you think some of the greatest successes are? And what are the most important changes that brought about those successes? So everybody join in.
Well, this is Wally Taylor. I think one of the big successes is shown on the cover of the new book, The Bobcat. It was almost, if not entirely extirpated at one point, and now there's a hunting season or a trapping season on them. So that was a real success.
I can think of another success that may have brought some problems along with it, and that would be the white-tailed deer. So any comments on any comments on that?
Well, this is Wally Taylor again. I guess I don't want to be the only one talking. But yeah, we have deer um, around our property, and they love to get into the bird feeders in the winter and eat the seeds. So my bright idea was to buy some shelled corn, throw it on the ground away from the feeders, and maybe the deer would eat the corn, which they did, and then they went to the feeders. So, um, and, and and I know that at least here in Cedar Rapids, um, there is a program for hunting deer to try to uh, thin the population down. But probably the biggest problem with the deer is that they have no natural predators anymore.
Yeah, oh, I've got the same problem. I'm in a city in Council Bluffs, and the deer will come in and eat my bird feeders. I can't throw uh, feed down just for them because that has become illegal in Council Bluffs. You can't feed wild animals in the city except for bird feeders and maybe squirrel turners or something like that. And they will sort of sit around and leave their deposits in my yard before they take off to someplace else.
And we do have a couple comments in the chat. How many bobcats will need to be introduced before they re become a deer predator?
David, maybe you could answer that, but I don't think bobcats would become a deer predator. They're a
Oh yeah.
pretty small animal.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that we would have a definite number. Bobcats have established themselves. They've been moving up primarily from Missouri into Iowa. There are questions about whether or not parts of north central Iowa and northwestern Iowa would have good habitat for them. They particularly like woodlands more than they like open prairies. Northeastern Iowa might be very good for them. But about the southern third of Iowa, all across those counties, now has a bobcat hunting season. So the DNR has assessed the bobcats as having a fairly stable and even breeding population there. So if they take, like young fawns or something like that in the spring, they'd be doing so really only in southern Iowa. And as far as I know, they're not nearly as plentiful through the rest of Iowa yet.
Now, the natural predator for deer is the cougar, which we used to have in Iowa. I think probably that original book by James Dinsmore um, documented that the cougars were once native to Iowa. And I haven't heard anything recently, but a number of years ago, every year there would be one or two cougars who would wander into Iowa, and then of course somebody would shoot them. And in fact, Pam and I filed a petition with the DNR to put the cougar on the endangered species list, the Iowa State Endangered Species List. And the DNR said no, they wouldn't do it because there was not a reproducing population in Iowa. Well, of course not. People are shooting them as soon as they get here. So then we tried to put it on the fur bearer list, which would mean that it would be protected until, if ever, there was enough of a population to have a hunting season, like they've done with the bobcat. But the legislature has to do that, and the Farm Bureau put up enough opposition that the legislature would not put the cougar on the fur bearer list. So we still don't have any kind of protection for cougars in Iowa. But I really haven't heard of any in the last few years. I don't know if anyone else online here has or not.
I haven't seen any, haven't heard of any in Potawatomi County in the past couple of years. Over the past decade or so, we had a couple of verified sightings, but there have been some more recently in Nebraska, which is right next door, and I suppose they could cross over the interstate if they wanted to, but that's not a very feasible pathway. The sightings that have been reported here probably generally turn out to be bobcats.
I was going to say this past winter, early spring, there were a couple reports that were unconfirmed of cougar in north central Iowa. The neat thing about that is that even though they're unconfirmed, there was at least one security camera photo of the cat, and it clearly was not a bobcat. So there may have been one passing
Yeah.
through, and we get those passing through from the main breeding, over in western South Dakota. There's some breeding that's done in western, maybe central Nebraska, and then they want to head east. They want to go north into Wisconsin, that sort of thing. And so it'd be great if we had them on the fur bearer list, and so that people couldn't just shoot them, and they could, reestablish.
And we do have a couple comments going back to deer. Someone mentioned deer population is down significantly, and then someone else said, Rose said urban deer are a problem here in Cedar Rapids area for sure. And then Diane had a question. They said, how do you think agricultural practices in the state are impacting wildlife habitat?
Yeah, the deer population is coming down, and a lot of that is probably due to chronic wasting disease and Bluetooth. When the populations grow again, the disease transmission is considerably easier. So that might be one of the reasons deer populations are down without natural predators.
Yeah, and the deer is kind of one of the ironies of kind of the first Dinsmore book, where, as you mentioned, Tom, it was this chronicle of wildlife just being decimated really within about 4 or 5 decades of Iowa becoming a state in 1846. And deer, as I recall, they did decline, but then they rebounded. And it's like the way that we managed our lands, in particular our woodlands, deer love edges. And so the edges of woodlots and agricultural fields, or the edges of woodlands with prairies, deer love the growth there. And we got rid of their predators, and they just started, to do fantastically well. And so if the deer population is down from an ecological standpoint, that's a good thing because they were overpopulated. From a hunting and revenue standpoint for the state, it's not a good thing. But, as, Rose pointed out, and shout out to Cedar Rapids, it was where I grew up. Deer can be a huge nuisance in many urban settings.
I laugh about the predator, uh, no natural predators. Well, they do have a predator, and it's called cars. And it seems like they're very clever about that now. They'll come to the edge of the road and they'll look left and they'll look right. And sometimes they'll look left or right again. And then they'll proceed if they don't see any cars. So they figured out what their predator is, even though it's not natural.
So I live on a remnant oak savanna in southeastern Iowa. And I was talking to our county forester. I think his name's Mike Vitash. And I asked him why there are so many degraded forests and why you don't see forest expanding, when the trees at the edges of the forest die off. there isn't new growth. And he said, it's the deer. It's all the deer. Forests in Iowa used to bounce back and regrow and expand like they do elsewhere, but now when they die, unless people replant them and cage them, you're not going to get trees again. Is that true, do you think? Do you agree with that?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
The first part of my career as a professor was out east near the Philadelphia area, and I learned there the eastern deciduous forest, basically no native trees are being reestablished because the deer eat them all. We have
Mhm.
been keeping deer herds at artificially very high levels, and they love the new growth. It provides better protein for them. There's more protein in the new growth of plants than there is in older growth, and so they preferentially will munch on that, and that means the new saplings. And a lot of saplings, wildflowers are just like candy to them. So a lot of the eastern deciduous forest is, as it ages, it's being replaced by non-native trees that deer don't preferentially eat.
Yeah, and across the river from here in Nebraska, the Fontenelle Forest System, for the longest time, their policy was a hands-off, let's let nature take its course. And they found, among other things, that the deer were suppressing the natural growth of the forest. There were too many non-native species coming in, too many junk species coming in. So now they have, along with some of their oak savanna restoration programs, a limited deer hunt during hunting season that has cut down the population considerably. Now all we need are some wolves, but I don't think that would be acceptable.
And wolves were probably not all that plentiful in Iowa historically anyway. In Dinsmore's first book, they chronicle, there were a lot of wolves that were taken in wolf pelts, but then he tried to go through the descriptions because a lot of what were called wolves back in the 1800s were very likely just coyotes.
That is, yeah.
And it was mostly coyotes. Of course, wolves would range into Iowa,
Mhm.
um, but they weren't that plentiful to begin with. But you would have some wolves, you would have some cougars, you would have foxes and coyotes that are at least large enough to take down fawns. You would
Mhm.
have some black bears as well, and so there were a variety of predators. Plus, of course, the deer would have had to contend with their larger cousins, the elk, that were extirpated. And so you also had, competitive herbivores that would have helped to hold the deer populations in check as well. And, when you get rid of almost all of that, now the deer population could explode.
Coyotes will take a fawn. Uh, and I out here, I'm in rural Guthrie County. And of course, I hear howling of coyotes every night from multiple directions. And occasionally I do find a fawn that has just been obliterated overnight. I mean, it's a sad and unbelievable sight to see this, but I have a ton of deer too. So I think the biggest thing that's killing deer now, besides the thousands of deer that are hit by cars, is this blue tongue, which is Guthrie County, where it's supposedly the most reported cases. But hunters tell me they're finding dead deer all over the place.
Hmm.
And they're having a tough time, especially finding that big buck that's lived long enough to, be a prized thing. You hardly see any, you know, anymore. So there is something controlling their population, but um, there's still a lot of them.
It's
Have you?
agricultural practices. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the lack of land and lack of habitat is probably the single biggest factor that's importing that's impacting that. And since this book was written in the well, even starting in the late 70s, early 80s, with the growth of industrial agriculture, you're losing more and more of that uh, uh, habitat. What used to be pasture is row crop. What used to be hedgerows is row crop. What used to be oats and a variety of different grains is soybean and corn. And that is also impacting the food sources for a lot of our animals, all the way up the food chain, with the decrease in insects, means a decrease in snakes, which means a decrease in small mammals, or you know, the whole chain.
Yep. And with the small mammals gone, the small herptiles
Yeah.
gone, then you lose the hawks, you lose, their predators. Iowa used to be one breakdown, and this does not include oak savanna as an ecosystem,
Mhm.
and it should, but one breakdown was 70% prairie, 20% woodland, primarily along the riverways, and then 10% wetlands. Today, Iowa's 66 or 63% corn and soybeans only. And just a little bit over 90% agriculture as a whole. So the rest of that would be for either pasture land or raising hay, some alfalfa, and then of course you got to bring in all of the CAFOs. And then, as Tom, you said, after the 70s, with the rise of the industrial agriculture, we got rid of the hedgerows, and the hedgerows were a great refuge for a lot of different species. And with those gone, and especially a lot of people don't like bugs, but the problem is once the insects go away, what eats insects? Either everything that's larger than them or something that's larger than an insect ate something else that ate an insect. So they are the absolutely necessary, um, you know, whenever say the basis for so many of the terrestrial food webs. And now that they're being decimated, then a lot of our other wildlife is, at least in question.
This might be a good time to plug our report that we did uh, several months ago, explaining the loss of habitat in Iowa, what that means, and how we can get those wildlife corridors back, and other legal and policy things that we can do to help wildlife in Iowa. And I think that report is on our website.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a question here from Jenna about that, who is wondering about the possibility of wildlife corridors in Iowa and even overpasses or underpasses for wildlife. And that was actually part of our report.
That was actually going to be my last question if we need to stir some debate up, and that will be the same period that he's talking about that sees these successes has also seen the growth of industrial agriculture. The amount of land devoted to wildlife through the DNR and stuff has increased. It's pretty much about doubled over the period of time, but they're isolated little islands, and can those successes be sustained if they're isolated little islands?
The observation has been made, and I think it may be true, that most of us in Iowa right now have never seen or experienced Iowa in its natural state. And so we don't really have the appreciation for Iowa as it was and as it supported all the wildlife that used to be here. So that's a big problem too, that we need to educate people a little more on what was here and why it's important to restore what we've lost. Somebody wanted a link to the report.
Yep, Pam posted the link.
There it is.
I think
Way to go,
Brianna.
Brianna.
Yep. So there have been some studies in Iowa where even though, I mean, we don't have any large areas of habitat left for the most part. If you think of like the boundary waters up in northern Minnesota, if you think about the Black Hills out in western South Dakota, if you think about those types of areas where you could say that those are still fairly large contiguous habitats where you can have breeding populations of even large predators. Iowa doesn't have that. But there have been some studies that have been done that have shown that if we have the political will to help farmers take uh, steep gradients, like above 9% out of row cropping, because arguably they shouldn't even be, cropped anyway because of, they're severely steep and the erosion is very real there. And also areas that were wetlands that were attempted to be drained, but they still flood essentially at least 1 out of every 5 years. If you take all of those out of production and we have good programs for farmers so that they can still earn an income on their land. They can put it into conservation reserve, they can put it into wetland reserve, and maybe even create another couple of programs that way that could be more permanent. And if we linked all that together, we could easily get back to 25% of Iowa being wild areas. They would be long strips of corridors, but basically then Iowa would be the state that links the big corridors like the Ozarks to our south, the Black Hills and maybe western Nebraska to our west, the boundary waters to our north, and even up into central and northern Wisconsin as well to our northeast. We could link all of that area back together, and we could see wildlife, even things like cougars that wouldn't have enough habitat to stay here. They would at least be able to traverse Iowa to get to other places where they could live.
And that's going to be a problem, having the political will to be able to give an incentive for farmers to do that on a longer term basis than even the current contracts, which are like 10 years. I have a friend who is taking his CRP out and putting it back in production because he doesn't trust the government to pay him over the next 10-year period. So
And we do have another question here in the chat. We have Linda said we are involved in several reintroductions in Blackhawk County, especially the osprey and river otter. Are there any other megafauna that would be attractive for reintroduction projects?
Part of the problem is the lack of large areas of contiguous habitat. Because like down at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge to the east of Des Moines, bison and elk have been brought back as they've been restoring. It was 5,000 acres of prairie. I know that they were going to expand to 8,000 acres, and I don't know how large they are right now. The problem is we don't have any, large contiguous areas where those types of animals can actually roam. So you can't really reintroduce them to the vast majority of Iowa. And then I think about like birds for megafauna. Barred owls were reintroduced several times, most notably back in the 1980s. And I think it was over like 400 birds, 450 birds, something like that, were released into the southern counties of Iowa, where it was considered to have really good barn owl habitat. And the owls all flew south to Missouri, and there's not even one recorded instance of them staying in Iowa and breeding. And greater prairie chickens have at times been reintroduced to a couple different areas of Iowa, and again, they all flew away as well. We just don't have enough contiguous habitat for a lot of the larger animals. So we would have to work on getting areas of contiguous habitat back that would be suitable for these animals. There are some that might be reestablishing themselves. Of course, the bobcat, maybe in southern Iowa, has kind of reestablished itself. Maybe we're getting some ideas of black bears reestablishing themselves in northeastern Iowa, where there might actually be some habitat for them.
And David, maybe
Yeah.
also part of the problem is that um, there's a lack of habitat for the prey that those megafauna would need to survive.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you're talking about any sort of predator. Yeah. It just isn't there. Barn owls were reintroduced. Yep. BARN. A question about whether it was barred or barn owls.
And then this question kind of also leads into Jim asked, so what do you see the future for wildlife in the next 10 years?
Well, I like Jenna's comment. We have enough raccoons for all predators everywhere. So maybe maybe we focus on raccoons as, the bear of Iowa. Over the next 10 years, what I would love to see is something like the proposal that the Sierra Club is trying to put forth to the people of Iowa, being adopted. And Wally wrote even a potential amendment to the Iowa State Constitution where we would all have the right to wild areas. And if we have the right to wild areas, that would force us to start to restore some habitat and make some decisions about what is a reasonable amount of habitat for wildlife versus what's a reasonable amount of land and waters for us to meet our own needs with. The DNR has said that they have about doubled the amount of their habitat in Iowa to, I think it's just under 4% of Iowa now. And I mean, if you think about that, it was about 2% of Iowa was left as wildlife habitat. Now maybe we're up to 3.5 to 4% of Iowa being wildlife habitat, and part of the problem with that is a lot of that so-called habitat is just road right-of-ways, essentially the ditches alongside of roads. And of course, we could have all kinds of programs making sure that native prairies are planted in those ditches, and those will help. But I think we need something where we start to see larger predators like black bears, cougars, the bobcat, not as threats, but as, our wildlife neighbors. And we need to protect them. We could put programs in place so that if farmers do lose animals to any of these predators, we can reimburse them and, start to have a different attitude toward wildlife. As we've seen, as I mentioned, the bobcat came back into Iowa, and I started to look at this and was like, is there, a few years ago, is there habitat in Northwest Iowa where I now live for bobcats? And I'm very skeptical that there is, but I found out, there was that hunting season for bobcats in Iowa. And I was thinking, my goodness, the bobcat has just begun to reestablish itself as a part of Iowa's wildlife. And what do we immediately do? Let's hunt it. It's like we need an attitude change. That's what I would like to see for the future of wildlife. We've seen in other states too, bring wolves back, let's hunt them. Let's constantly do the exact same types of activities that extirpated, these wonderful wild neighbors in the first place. I think we need an attitude change, and that starts with a campaign for the hearts and minds of the people of Iowa.
Another aspect of habitat that maybe we don't always think about is water quality. All the aquatic species that depend on clean water, and as I think most of us know, our water quality in Iowa is pretty poor, to say the least. And so I think we need to continue to be concerned about water quality and do something about it.
I mean, rivers are natural water corridors to begin with. And then if we link that with reestablishing some natural corridors, like over the next 10 years, because, we're not going to get an Ozarks like area in Iowa over the next 10 years. But if we can reestablish some corridors, if we can get a bill passed where some of the Department of Transportation money would go to also assessing, hey, wait a minute, this is a stretch of highway where we have, a lot of cars hitting deer. That causes, millions of dollars in damages to our property. And then, of course, people ending up sometimes in the hospital. We can minimize that with good underpasses and good overpasses. I think we can do that over the next 10 years.
And there are a number of farmers who wouldn't take too much convincing to put their land into natural habitat because they like natural habitat. It
Yeah.
just needs to be securely economically feasible for them. And so we need a program that will incentivize that.
Yeah, here on that one.
Yeah.
I was at a presentation a couple years ago where farmers from central Iowa presenting to us up here in the Sioux City area, and about all kinds of, regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture, and what they can do, some of the procedures that they've instituted on their farms. And then it came down to the end, and they're still growing primarily corn and soybeans. So we asked them, it's like, okay, so you're talking about everything you can do to reinvigorate the land, and that you care about your land so much. Why are you still growing corn and soybeans? And the answer was, well, we're stuck with what is financially feasible. If we plant something else, we're likely to not get crop insurance on it. And so if it's a bad year, now we have no income and we're likely to lose our farm in 1 year. So we have to create some sort of economic system where farmers can actually do something else and know that they can still retain their farm if it's a bad year.
This may be off the subject somewhat, but there have been uh, writings, reports, articles that if farmers grew food for people instead of corn for ethanol or even a feed for animals as much, that they could make more money on less acres or fewer acres than they are now. But there are large corporations that control the agricultural system, and they're dictating economically that the farmers have to grow corn and beans.
Mm-hmm.
And it is possible that at some time we can do something to that effect, and we can restore natural habitat. Well, when you look at the East Coast, as farming moved out towards the west, New England was pretty much just farm fields, and it is now quite a bit eastern deciduous forest, mostly secondary growth, but nature can come back if we can change our habits.
And we have a book recommendation here, Sea of Grass, The Conquest, Ruin, and Redemption of Nature on the American Prairie, from Denise. And actually, that one's on my to-read list. I haven't gotten to it yet. But that might
That'll
be
be our
a
next
good book for
webinar,
another book discussion.
David.
There we go.
Yeah, that's about down on my stack too. So Denise, are you going to lead a book discussion on this?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, we have another one. Back in the early 1900s, Iowans grew a wide variety of actual food for humans until they changed to row crops and CAFOs. That's so true. I remember, my mom was she worked in the city in hospitals, and then she became a teacher. And my dad was a pastor, but of course, their parents were farmers, and so my mom grew up in central Iowa, and then she would tell stories about growing up on the farm, and it's like her parents asking, okay, what are we going to eat tonight? And it's like, well, maybe it's about time to have ham again. Okay, well, then they would plan, for ham and bacon and everything. Grandpa would go out and select the hog and, slaughter the hog. And if it was chicken tonight, then grandma would go out and, to the coop, find a chicken, wring their neck, pluck them, and that sort of thing. That's kind of the way it was. And you had a diversified farm. And on a diversified farm, you could also have animals like guinea fowl actually naturally eating a lot of the insect pests. But yeah, now it's huge acreages of row crops, and then they depend so much on the fertilizers and the pesticides and the herbicides, and that all takes a toll on water quality and habitat quality for Iowa's water wildlife.
That's such a great point. And Jim said, are there any, sorry, do recent surveys of wildlife populations exist? Where are results published? Iowa Academy of Science. And then also Rose said Braiding Sweetgrass, another fantastic book. Love that one.
Yeah, we could learn from our indigenous neighbors. The DNR puts out a report on the state of Iowa's wildlife, but they mostly report on game animals. You can kind of read between the lines on the game animals, though, because they need healthy insect populations. We're talking about game birds, or they need smaller mammals and birds and reptiles, if they're other types of game animals, or if they're deer, of course, then they need at least somewhat decent quality habitat. Um, Otherwise, there are a lot of reports that can be published in the Iowa Academy of Science, but will be published in scientific literature in general. American Midland Naturalist is another place, although I haven't seen as much from Iowa in there, but
The DNR also publishes some of their volunteer wildlife monitoring surveys. They have surveys for eagle nest monitoring, osprey monitoring. They do a bat survey. They do a number of spotlight surveys that will be looking at some of the smaller mammals and things like that. They'll for their staff will do that. And there's a volunteer frog and toad monitoring survey that's done annually, and the DNR publishes reports on that. I'm not quite sure how to get them. I participate in some of that, so I get those reports. I'm not sure how we would get them, but you can go out to the DNR website and look at some of those reports. They're buried. You have to really scrounge through the DNR's website to get some of their information, but they're buried out there somewhere.
And another book recommendation is Dirt to Soil, One Family's Journey into Regenerative Agriculture.
There's even some research by, God forbid, Iowa State that shows a 5 crop rotation of corn, soybeans, alfalfa, and oats can be more profitable and produce more and be better for the land, for the soil, than the strictly corn and soybean rotation, but I don't really see that going anywhere.
They've also done some good research with those prairie strips where like 10% of each acre of farmland or up to 20% would be put into strips of prairie. And they've documented how that has reduced soil erosion. It has brought back increased populations of insects, of small birds, of small mammals, of small reptiles, et cetera. It's had all of these benefits for wildlife and has not really significantly taken a ton of area out of crop production.
Right. And it's actually a little bit more cost effective because with the natural predators for the herbivorous insects, you have less reliance on pesticides.
Right.
So
So those are some other avenues that we can look at over the next 10 years for wildlife as well. I mean,
But we do have a little bit under 15 minutes. Are there any other questions about the book or just wildlife in general?
yeah, and Jim Johnson points out and reduction of nitrogen runoff, which
Oh, yeah.
we didn't say with the prairie strips, but that's very true. Yeah. I guess one of the things I would say is I haven't finished I Was Changing Wildlife yet, but the subtitle is 3 Decades of Gain and Loss. And in some ways it's almost a hopeful book compared to the first book, because I've read the first book, A Land So Full of Game, and it's just this chronicle of the decimation of Iowa's wildlife for the most part. I always thought like the woodcock was a rare bird, and it's a really, really interesting bird if you know what it looks like. I had no idea, but James Dinsmore chronicled that thousands upon thousands of woodcocks were caught every single year for several decades in Iowa and then shipped east, and they often appeared on the plates of people eating out at restaurants in our larger eastern cities in the late 1800s and maybe even early 1900s. So, Iowa supported tons and tons and tons of wildlife that we really killed off. But this second book, over the last 30 years, yeah, there have been gains that have been lost, but those gains to me provide hope.
They do. There are some species, like elk and bison, that will never come back because there is absolutely no way that we're going to be able to get the land back, enough land back to support them. But for some of the smaller uh, wildlife, um, there is a bit of hope. And like the book says, the DNR has pretty much doubled uh, their land. Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation does quite a bit of work on trying to convince farmers to or landowners to deed some of that, sell it, deed it, put it in trust. There are organizations, and the Sierra Club does a lot of work. I don't want We are the Sierra Club. We do a lot of work trying to get this done. So there are non-governmental organizations that are putting some pressure on. Probably we're not quite as big as the Farm Bureau, but things are happening, and they could be looking up, particularly if you get a more responsive legislature and governor.
Maybe we'll
And
start
DNR
selling
director.
insurance, Tom.
Huh?
Maybe we'll start selling insurance.
Yeah.
And Pam points out the trumpeter swans have made a nice comeback, and Linda pointed out bald eagles and peregrine falcons have come back. And then we have a couple questions. I'm going to take the second question first because the first question seems like the wrap-up question. Second question is, did fur trappers have an impact on the decline of any wildlife in Iowa?
Oh, yeah.
Of course, the answer is yes. There used to be beavers throughout the state. There used to be mink. Otters, obviously, were largely extirpated from the state. There used to be a number of smaller fur bearers that were trapped, every single year. And again, the first book chronicles this, that Iowa became a state in 1846. It was largely unsettled until somewhere around the 1830s. So it's like it just burgeoned and then suddenly became a state. And then within 4 to 5 decades after being a state, it's just like the wildlife was just largely gone. And a lot of the fur bearers were gone because of trapping. And trapping also helped to eliminate a lot of bobcat, foxes, as well.
I do think there's a lot of hope, though. Every time the legislature brings up an issue related to reducing the land holdings by the Department of Natural Resources or trying to limit how they can acquire land, there is an outpouring at the Capitol. I mean, it's one of the biggest issues that brings the most people to the Capitol. And if we keep our pressure on our legislators and let our governor know, and as we work on political races, let folks know that this is an issue and it's really important to Iowans, I think we can multiply our power, and I think we need to continue to do that.
And so then I'll ask this other question. To me, seems kind of like a wrap-up question. If you could make any changes to help wildlife, what would they be?
My primary change would be to incentivize landowners to put more of their land into conservation.
I guess what I would say is, two things. I would love to see corridors. I want to see some sort of rewilding bill where we're starting to put corridors back in that reconnect our small and fragmented habitats and provide a way for wildlife populations to be linked to each other again genetically like they used to be. That is one of the ways that they're going to persist until we take stronger measures. And then the second thing I would like to see is some way of actually beginning to tackle the water quality issues we have by limiting the amount of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers that are put onto our agricultural fields that run off into our waters. There are several different ways of tackling that, but when they run off into our waters, they're also in the land. They blow up into the air because they're attached to soil particles that the wind picks up, and that has negative effects on a variety of different wildlife.
And to follow up, I think we need a different way to do agriculture so that it's more in tune with the land and with the nature.
Yep. City lawns get a lot of chemicals too.
Yep.
That's from Lisa. Jim says better control of calf-cow operations near existing trout streams. Oh, yes. And then Jenna says permaculture. Wouldn't that be something?
And going back to one of your comments, I think a lot of people are really interested in, converting their lawns or helping their pastures become more native. What are some good resources that people can use if they're just getting started, maybe aren't exactly sure how to do it?
A homegrown national park is probably a very good book to start on. Okay, my old brain is having a brain fart here because I can't remember the can't remember
Douglas
the author's name.
Tallamy.
Tallamy, thank you. But Homegrown National Park and some of the other books is probably one of the best places to start.
Yep. For your own lawn, there can be things you don't necessarily need a lot of knowledge. Just, like Google, native prairie plants or native forest plants, depending on which ecosystem you live in Iowa, and try to plant native. Look up what your local city ordinance is. There are a lot of cities, if you live in the city, will not allow, an entire lawn to become, like wildflowers or something like that. But you can use it for landscaping, and then you can each year just kind of enlarge the area of your garden. And as long as it looks kind of like a garden, usually you don't have a problem with your neighbors or city officials. Yep, Doug Tallamy, Homegrown National Park,
Yep.
is, if you want to read about it, they're also online, Homegrown National Park. You can Google that. They have their own website, and they can help out with that. If you have more land, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is just a fantastic organization to consult with. Iowa State Extension is actually also quite good. Even the Nature Conservancy can help with anything that you might be interested in terms of not only converting land, but in easements. And if you have a significant amount of acreage, you should look at either conservation reserve or easements where you can get an income off of your land while planting it back into either native prairie or native forest or native wetland.
And the Zerke Society on their website has a lot of good information, a lot of good free information that you can just download about native plantings and
Yeah. Oh, Iowa Prairie Network. Yep,
yeah,
Pam, thank
yeah.
you. Also, Pheasants Forever. And a lot of people, of course, are interested in not just having natural land, but they're also like, well, how can I have land for pheasants? Or how can I have land for deer? How can I support turkey? You can look at Trout Unlimited. You can look at Pheasants Forever. They also have a lot of advice for landowners about what you can do to make your land or the waters that run through your land more wildlife friendly.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're ready to close it out with just a minute left. If there's any last minute questions, feel free to put them in the chat or email us after and we'll make sure to get back to you. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and having such a fantastic discussion with us. Thank you so much, David and Tom. You guys were awesome. Thank you so much for all the insight. And this will be posted on our YouTube if you wanted to go back on any of the great resources that we mentioned or anything like that. But otherwise, thank you so much again. Have a fantastic evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.